Well, it's good to meet you, Kirk. I knew nothing about you until a few weeks ago when a friend of mine whose father was a pastor not far from where you are in the prairies said, "Have you ever read Unwin on sexuality?" And I said, "I looked at the book years ago, but I wasn't ready for it. I must go back." And then I got back and immediately ran into you, which was delightful because Unwin, being a genuine Oxford intellectual of the 1930s and before, doesn't say anything in 3 words where 300 would do. And you've done the hard work. And it was also an area of human activity at the moment that's been bothering me for quite a while as to how we as Christians are really missing the boat in a big way. So, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up being interested in Unwin, and we'll take it from there.
I grew up on a cattle and grain farm in central Manitoba, and it was hard work, and I eventually, after high school, decided I needed a holiday, so I went to university, did a degree in physics, and then after that, mechanical engineering, and worked as an experimental test engineer for Pratt & Whitney for 4 years. And during that time, both my wife and I really felt an increasing, growing conviction we wanted to be working with people in some sort of Christian ministry of some description. An elder in our church suggested Power to Change, which is who I've worked with now for over 40 years. Specifically, I work with digital strategies, which is a subdivision. And so I worked with students for about 36 years on university campuses and had an enormous amount of interaction with them. Probably talked one-on-one with somewhere around 2,000 students. And these were mostly non-Christian, non-church people. But as I spoke with them, there were 2 major problems they had. One had to do with the problem of evil and suffering in this world, and the other had to do with the problem of science. And so I decided to do a master's in philosophy in the problem of evil and suffering at the University of Manitoba, and published a few papers on that in some philosophy journals. And then I wanted to dive into the science end of things, so I did a PhD in biophysics at the University of Guelph and published a few more papers. Maybe I'd like to do one more, but really I wanted to focus on a particular area that I was interested in. Now, in the meantime, I really felt that I needed to leave something behind because I'm not going to live forever, not here. And so I decided I'll join the digital strategies component. So my job is basically to produce online content in the form of YouTube videos and articles, and I think next month we're planning to start a podcast series so that there's just like a library, a reference library for people someday who happen to stumble across it, and hopefully they can be helped. So it's basically a dump of everything that I've learned over the years, or at least a lot of it, and to leave behind me, and that's what I do now. Now, I should mention and whatever I put up there, there's always a link so people can actually talk to a real person afterwards if they want to. We have about 800 or 900 mentors around the world in various languages. So that's the other side, and that's what my wife is involved in, the whole mentor aspect of this. So I produce the content. She helps with the oversee the mentoring aspect of things, and it seems like I'm very happy. It's kind of like my dream job.
Wonderful. Have you come across Freedom Halls yet?
No, not Freedom Halls.
Well, your wife might be very interested in that. We've only just been sort of contacted by them. This is a result of a missionary in Brazil realizing that the education system is being taken away from Christians for no good reason. And basically, I say they've come up with a way of laundering credits, but that's being a little unkind, but it's what we need because the accreditation business is the biggest rip-off in education at the moment, isn't it? And
that is a serious problem.
We need to undermine it. And they've come up with a way to do it, so you might be interested. There's lots of things I want to talk to you about, but let's get back to the main course. I had a somewhat similar journey, so except that I didn't stay on track like you. So I grew up in a Christian home, and where the Bible was read twice a day, whether I liked it or not, and many more times over the weekend. And of course, to a child who happens to have that kind of mind that remembers, that's an incredible gift. because the scriptures are there as a reference bank in the back of my mind, as a moral guidance, if you like. And I came from a blue-collar background, but got a scholarship for which I didn't apply, which took me to one of the best schools in England for secondary school, the same school that Tolkien had gone to a generation before. This was a time when 3% of the population went to university, but everyone from that school went to university if they wanted to. So I was actually translated into a better-than-university environment for my high school. I went to my first high school homeroom, and the master spoke 5 languages. I thought, oh, so this is high school. And it was. And, I mean, nobody in my family had ever been to university. So I had no guilt about anything. I just enjoyed it and lapped it up without really thinking about what it meant. And, of course, when it came to an end, I hadn't a clue what I wanted to do. So I sort of drifted in the direction of the biological sciences. So I went to medical school. Birmingham University Medical School took everybody from that school who wanted to go, so we didn't really have to do any work to go. But I had a friend that I went on long cycling trips with, and he said, "You've got to leave home. It's too narrow. You don't understand. You can't go to Birmingham." And he made me apply. I'd missed Oxford and Cambridge, but he said, "You can still go to London." And he more or less made me apply, and I ended up going to St George's Hospital Medical School, part of King's College in London. And that also was fun because medicine's a bit boring in many ways. I mean, it's not intellectually demanding. So you could play truant frequently without any problem. And by that time, I'd become a passionate rock climber. So I played truant very frequently. But it didn't matter. Then in my residency, I made a stupid bet with another resident when I was doing neurology in Oxford, that if you wanted to take the higher degree, that the sort of medical equivalent of PhD is called the Fellowship of the Royal College of Physicians in Canada, the Brits wanting more gradation, called membership of the Royal College of Physicians. But it's the same thing. It's the equivalent of boards, but there were not many specialty boards at that time. And my basic comment was that, well, the only question you ever get asked in an oral exam, which is what mattered most in the British system, is what am I thinking now? So don't talk about the latest enzyme discoveries for somebody who's approaching 80, be sensible. Play a lot of poker, learn to read people's faces, and you can't fail. And he said, you're just pushing the limit. And I said, well, I'd got myself in, so... Neurology in those days had no treatment, so you didn't have a great deal of pressure on you. You could organise your day very functionally if you wanted to, which I did. And cut a long story short, I passed. So, but the problem is, I think Tolkien got his idea of not becoming mature in Hobbitland until you're 30 from the general practice in England, that you would never become a consultant before you were 30. But I'd passed all the exams before I was 25, so I had years to fill in. So I went round a sequence of specialties, getting bored with each in turn. And then I'd met my wife, fortunately, to whom whatever she does, I will never be able to pay back, because I was losing my way Christianly. I'd listened to Martin Lloyd-Jones or John Stott on Sunday for the first 4 years in university. Most weeks, not every week. But without realizing what an incredible gift that was. I think they were the 2 greatest evangelical preachers of the 20th century. They'd certainly stand up in that rank. And I can still remember their sermons. Some people who went to Lloyd-Jones for years come up to me in America afterwards and say, "You went to the chapel, didn't you?" They can pick up the impact. But he got to my head, not my heart. That was going to be a lot longer coming. So we got married, and we weren't going to have kids. We were going to have careers, but shortly we had 3. We were careless. Fortunately, Sally loved kids, so that was easy. But I went out in the morning before the kids were awake and came back when they were asleep far too often. That's medicine. not a good idea. And she said, I need more help. Do something different for a bit. So I said, well, I'm bored and I won't get a consultant job and it won't do me any harm to go and do a PhD. So you collect degrees. I collected one at that stage, and it meant that I was home at 6 o'clock every day. And I read to my children all those things, which I now realise are vitally important. I didn't realise then, but all my children know that. I mean, I'm sure you've had the same comment from your children. Our most important education occurred at the dining room table. And we are not teaching that. Only the Jews take it really seriously, and we need to copy them. That's why they win all the Nobel Prizes. I mean the real ones, not the silly ones like peace. When that was over, Sally said, I like this life better than being a consultant. Find something useful to do with your PhD. So I went looking for an application for a technique I'd invented, and I found a problem in severely malnourished children of the developing world, so that I could answer and nobody else in the world could. That's perfect for research. So I went to the Wellcome Trust, who are superb employers, and said, here's the problems, here's what I can do, will you pay? And they said yes. I thought I could spare 2 years, but we then spent 7 years in Jamaica. And that's another whole story. But it wasn't until I got to Jamaica that there were the beginnings of what you're talking about, and I think we will talk about quite a lot. We went to a little Brethren assembly near the university because a lot of students went there. And I discovered all these lovely kids from Christian homes scattered throughout the Caribbean coming to Jamaica for university. And they land at the airport, and then they have a 20-minute, half-hour drive in a taxi or bus. And on the right-hand side, there are mansions. And on the left-hand side, there are shacks. And in between, there's the runoff in the rainy season, which washes the shacks away quite often. So they arrive at the university with a heightened sense of social injustice. We're talking about the 1970s. And nobody had ever talked to them about justice in their churches. It wasn't a subject. And there was Castro in his heyday and the Marxists taking over the university campus, and they didn't know how to deal with it. Well, I'd flirted with Marxism and I lost that very quickly by going behind the Iron Curtain. That cured me. And I said, well, it's easy. And I ended up bringing them home for lunch. And years later, I'm still meeting people who remember that, and it was important. And that kind of thing brings tears to your eyes, doesn't it? When you were allowed to do something, you had no idea what it meant or how important it was or anything like that. You were just in that position, you could do it, so you did it. And then years later, they come back and say, thank you. I said, well, don't thank me. But that's our world, and the kids out there don't know anything about that kind of subjective sense of what faith does as well. And I didn't have much space for the subjective side of things. I'm only at this late stage beginning to realise it matters more than I realised, but it has to be dealt with very carefully because it easily gets out of control. Now, what brought you immediately into focus is that when I'm asked the question, what's happened most to medicine that you dislike in your lifetime? I said, well, one of them that's not getting touched at all, especially in our churches, is sexuality. When I went through medical school, I needed to know 4 sexually transmitted diseases in some detail, and I couldn't fail finals on that issue. Now you need 40. There is not progress. And learning how to talk about it in a rational way that can stop the liberal elite and the libertarians in their tracks is not easy, but Unwin did it, didn't he, really? He gave us the material anyway, but not in a format that's ever going to reach people who have a feeling about the first sentence and don't listen after that. So what brought you to engage with him?
Several years ago, I was listening to a friend of mine speak, and he mentioned the research of J.D. Unwin and how He wasn't very detailed on it. It was about 1 or 2 sentences, but how civilizations and cultures collapsed once they began to loosen up their sexual restraints. So I found that in the back of my mind. I kept thinking about it over the years, and I thought I need to get into this at some point, and eventually did. I found the book was out of print, but I did find an archive online where you could download the book, and I worked my way through it the first time, and I thought, wow, this is, I'm not even sure how I can condense this down into a bite-sized format, and it sat there for maybe another 2 years. But then I thought to myself, I really do need to get this out there, and so I worked through it the second time, meticulously underlining, making quotes. I prepared 26 pages of quotes that I picked, such that if you read that 26-page quote summary, you basically have Unwin's research, although Unwin said that his book is really only a small summary of, though it probably take 20 volumes. So, but that 26-page summary, almost no one will read that. At least that's my feeling nowadays. Yeah. Except for people who really want to dive into it. But so I just wrote this article online, and I was astounded. I think within the same day I wrote it, there was a professor at Princeton, Professor Robert P. George.
Oh, yes, I know him.
And somebody showed him my article, and he really liked it, and he said some positive things about it. And I don't know if that was his comments or not, but in the next few days, I started getting over 100,000 views on this article. And since then, I continue to have interviews, Poland, England, around the world, New Zealand, on this thing. So but as I read that, I also wondered, so what is it about sexual freedom? No, Unwin was very honest. He said he can only speculate, and he thought it might have something to do with sexual energy. That is a different aspect. His research is detailed, pedantic, rigorous. It's a general anesthetic in the form of words. But if you that part, I think, is impeccable. And Robert P. George said the same thing. No one to this day has actually done the kind of work that J.D. Unwin did, which, because I went and looked into it myself, has somebody, what's happened since then, and I can find no serious response to Unwin's research. But the beauty of his research is that, and some people take this as an immediate negative, the beauty is that he published this book in 1934, and the most common thing is just to simply write it off and say, oh, we've moved way beyond that. But we haven't. No one has done the kind of research. But more beautiful is that his research showed that there were 3 indicators which we can use as predictions to test his research. And there were 3 indicators of what happens once a culture crosses that tipping point. And so we, in the 21st century, can actually test his results.
Yep, we have done.
And his findings and his observations. Yeah.
We've done an experiment
of nature. And those 3 indicators, it's all happening again. And the word he used is happens with, and I quote, monotonous regularity. Yeah. We keep going down. In fact, I don't like to say this, but he said it was irreversible. And I always like to say, oh, there's got to be some way out of this predicament. Yeah, we need a massive spiritual awakening is what I pray for. And that, I believe that could turn things around, at least here in my own country of Canada. I prayed for years. A massive, great spiritual awakening that'll just turn this country on a dime. But I can't do that.
If we had a massive awakening to sort of first-level Christianity conversion, we wouldn't be able to do the important bit, which is discipleship. We haven't got the people who could do it.
That's a good point. Most people are not trained in how do you follow when a person starts to put their faith in Christ, and what do you do with them? How do you help them grow spiritually? And most people...
I never heard a sermon, I should have done, I'm sure, but where Jesus says, go and tell what the Lord has done for you.
That's the most powerful.
That's one sentence. And if you don't have anything to say, you better get down on your knees and start work.
Oh, exactly.
When that happens, your life becomes so much better, doesn't it? For me, it was It was medical students. And I came back from a sabbatical, must have been in 87, something like that. And it was in Africa. I was bullied into going to Africa because of what I knew. I didn't want to go, but we went, and it was wonderful. That was the year that Alan Bloom published The Closing of the American Mind. And I knew it was making waves, but I hadn't had time to read it, so I thought, I'll read it on the plane. So I picked it up. The book's not really worth very much, except the first chapter, and perhaps the chapter on values. But the first chapter set me back on my heels completely. I couldn't get over what he was saying, because the first chapter is called The Empty Slate, and the empty slate was the students I was teaching medicine and biochemistry to. They were empty slates. They had no cultural history. They had no history, period. And I thought, it can't be as bad as he says. And then at the end of the first chapter, about 2 paragraphs from the end, he allows himself to reminisce about his family history. Now, Alan Bloom was a radical homosexual, but also the best teacher of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle the University of Chicago has had in the last 50 years. And he wrote the book because the students arriving were not capable of handling him, and he wasn't prepared to do the remedial training that was needed. And he says this, then I'll tell you how I extrapolate, or I might ask you how you would extrapolate. We'll see when we get there. But he starts thinking about his grandparents, and he says, my grandparents were ignorant folk. They were first-generation Jews in America from Eastern Europe. And he said they never went inside an institution of higher learning. But everything done in their home was spiritually rich. They found reasons for the performance of their duties and the bearing of their sorrows by reference to the book, the Old Testament. And they could go to the synagogue, where they heard great scholars who spoke not from an alien perspective, but from the same perspective, while simply going deeper and providing guidance. That, says Bloom, and this is my favorite definition of the buzzword amongst evangelicals community, he says that is what a community is, something that invites high and low into a common story of meaning. Just think of what Jordan Peterson, this response to what he said, which is basically a banal book at one level, the first one. When I read it, I thought, I wouldn't have needed any of this. But he found that the students needed it desperately. He then really puts the nail in the coffin. He says, when I look at my cousins, all of whom have been educated in the American way, all of whom have MDs or PhDs, they have no wisdom comparable to that of my grandparents. When they speak of the meaning of life and death, the relationship between husbands and wives, parents and children, it's a bunch of cliches. That is astonishing, isn't it? But he was absolutely right. You obviously agree from what you said already.
It's a tragedy. I grieve for it. It's such a large problem that one could despair on how could I possibly make a difference. But I just remember what's my own personal mission. What should I be doing? And I focus on that with the idea that somehow my little bit is going to be important in a lot of other things, missions that other people are involved in.
Well, you know already that is the case from the response you got in days. We're speaking to small audiences at the moment, but they're important. Have you been picked up yet by the medical community? Not yet, I suspect.
I do have friends in the medical community who are very much involved in discussions of MAID. But as far as, not really much interaction there. I don't know who all subscribes. I have maybe 2,000 subscribers.
But what happened to me when I got back from Africa, I said somehow in a biochemistry lecture to the students that if Alan Bloom is right, you're a bunch of ignoramuses. Now, if you said that today, there'd be a riot on the spot. But this was 1987. They were still polite. But at the end of the lecture, I had about 20 of them or so come and demand an apology. You've no right to call us ignorant. You don't know.
Wow.
And I said, well, it wasn't me that said it. It was Alan Bloom, so I'm not going to apologize. But we're a quasi-experimental faculty. Why don't we do the experiment? And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, Alan Bloom, I think if I read him aright, is saying that you don't know the Old and New Testaments of the Bible so that he can use those metaphors to teach, then you're ignorant. Because all great societies are made by a great book, as happens to be the Bible, whether you like it or not. You can't read Shakespeare with understanding if you don't know the Bible. There's almost any great... The reason you don't like the old books is you can't understand them because you don't have the background necessary. Whereas my uneducated grandfather could quote reams of Shakespeare, even though he was a Marxist. The world's at a different place, and they said... I said, why don't we do the experiment? They said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you all think Gandhi's the greatest thing since sliced bread. He said the Sermon on the Mount was the greatest literature he ever read. Tell me how it starts and what it says. Zero. Absolute zero. Nothing. And I said, well, there you are. You're ignorant. QED. And then they said, bless them, what are you going to do about it? I said, it's your problem, not mine. I'm busy. And they said, but you claim to know important things that we should know. We don't. Why don't you help us? So I said, well, what you need is an Agnostics Anonymous group because you don't even know the questions, let alone the answers. And they said, that's right. Will you do it? And so AA was born on the spot. And the only prerequisite for it was that you couldn't claim to be a Christian. The Christians crept in after we'd started, but they were not allowed to speak. And I got a quarter of the class every year for the next few years.
That's wonderful. That's so encouraging.
We all have those existential questions looming at the back of our minds, and we can't even translate them at the moment. And sexuality's right there. We never discuss it properly in church. I mean, every year there must be a Christian doctor there who actually rub their noses in the reality of promiscuous sex and perverted sex and call it what it is and show why that is a right definition. And that's not difficult to do. But the big revolution, of course, happened in 1960. What was that?
The sexual revolution in the mid-'60s?
At the beginning of the 60s, yeah.
What was the big sexual revolution? What was the start of the 1960s? No, I was about 6 years old.
You're 6 years old. Well, you wouldn't know. It was the contraceptive pill.
Oh, yes. The pill was a big step forward in the sexual revolution.
I was in my 20s. And I remember listening to a Reese lecture by the guy who invented it, saying how proud he was of the fact that he'd now separated sexual pleasure from reproduction. And we've seen the results. And that was the experiment that Unwin needed to see happen, because before the pill came along, there was lots of talk but not much action. Now there's less talk and continuous action. And empty lives because of what it does.
Yeah, in so many ways. I think Mary Eberstadt, when I wondered what is it about sexual freedom that destroys a culture, I happened to just read a book by Mary Eberstadt right shortly afterwards called Primal Scream. And it talked about things like this escalation on people, mental health challenges, identity politics, mass shootings, and it all flows. And so she traced it back. I was impressed with her book because of the sheer number of references in the back. Plus, she got some commentary from other people to contribute. But it all stemmed back to the sexual revolution, and it seems to be, she suggested, that it's the decimation of the family, the number of siblings and cousins, and that created an identity for people, and it created a context within which people can start learning ethics and morality, as your reference to Ellen Bloom's grandparents did. They weren't educated, but they learned these things within the context of family. And yet today, the family, if you're talking about a traditional family, that's almost seen as almost maybe racist, bigoted. It's not a good thing in the eyes of a number of activists in the academia. But it's the very thing we need. It's the very context within which the health of the humanity, the work ethic comes out of that. That's where I learned the work ethic. And without a work ethic, our culture will have decreasing numbers of people capable. Yeah,
now in England, people who are unemployed don't use unemployed, they say fun-employed. And some of them say, I have no intention of ever going to work again. That's the end of a culture. We are in deep, deep trouble in that respect. Now, the next thing that happened to me in this journey will interest you too, and I'm sure you're going to have many more important things to say about it. But after the first year in Africa, I had set up a program to resuscitate malnourished children, and my children did the work, and I trained some Africans. I went back a year later, and I could already measure the decline in the program. One of the nurses I'd trained had his own child die of malnutrition. So I said, what on earth happened? And he told me he was going to lie by looking at the ground and not at me. And he said, well, we didn't feed them properly. But I knew he didn't believe that. So I sent my supervisor. I want to know what he really believed. It took 2 minutes. And he said he believed that an evil spirit had taken the child's appetite away, and he had spent his money on the witch doctor, and the child had died. Evil spirits are not to be laughed at, are they? That way of looking at the world answers the questions of living in the middle of Africa better than the Christian story does at first sight. I mean, if half your children die before maturity, your crops fail apparently at random, you have no explanation for anything that matters. Fatalism is the way out. And that's what they buy into. But the bit of Africa we know well on the borders of Rwanda had a revival in the 1930s, the Rwanda revival, in which there was a huge turning to Christ at a sort of level 1. And you can still meet people, or when we first went, you could meet people who remembered dancing in the streets with joy at becoming Christian. But it had no content, or very little. And we did nothing about discipleship. And so I was sitting around that second year trying to understand what was going on, instead of, being busy weighing and measuring children and all that stuff. And my wife likes me to be busy, and she said, what's the matter? And I said, I'm thinking. She said, it looks to me like you're doing nothing. And we had a good old-fashioned family row. But she won, of course, and said, well, at least you could do a Bible study with the graduates who've been to university in the village who are not working. Because all that happens, you send an African to university, he wants a white-collar job. So you get a lawyer or a politician, now I could rip everybody off. But these are Christian guys and working in a pharmacy. And I said, that's an interesting idea. So she said, you should do Deuteronomy. I think they'll find that interesting. Because I'd met Bruce Walke, and he'd changed my thinking on covenant quite seriously. So we started doing a Bible study on Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6, basically. And they loved it, although we had to start in English and go to Swahili and then the tribal language, or French, it was a slow process. But they loved it. And then to sort of make sure I didn't miss the point, God sent me a translator who walked 1,000 kilometers to get to me, and he didn't know why. He'd grown up in that area and knew the tribal language, which is tonal and very difficult for any outsider. But he'd gone to Tanzania for education, learnt English, was a Muslim. Like many Muslims in Africa, he started being discontented with Islam. And he had this dream, being told to go and talk to the Christians. The dream was so persistent he did, that he only needed to hear the gospel laid out once, and that was it. Then he started having another dream saying, go back to your birthplace. So he packed his wife up and walked around close to 1,000 kilometers around Lake Tanganyika to the other side. No boats going across. And he was helping a little Quaker mission. He knew that wasn't what he was there for, but he didn't know what it was. And then he became my translator. A few weeks later, I had the biggest congregation I've ever had. 6,000 out of doors one afternoon, because the tribal leaders, the tribes all thinks of itself as Christian. They made me tell them what I was teaching the young men. They say, you have to teach everyone. So with no electricity, but they'd got a row of D cells about a yard long that powered a megaphone. And of course, Mapendo had to do that. I just had to do it in English. But what I was talking about is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And if you want to test biblical illiteracy in your church, ask people in the church to complete the verse. They'll never get it right. In the first talk I gave on this, I only got it half right. And maybe I only know it's half if I think I've got it right now, which I think I do, but I may not. But most people don't. They give you, and your neighbour is yourself, which is Leviticus 19. It's not Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6 is much more important. After all, Deuteronomy was our Lord's favourite book. And it's, these things shall be upon your heart. You must hold them passionately. And you must teach them to your children. When you sit at table, when you rise up, when you lie down, when you go on a journey. It's all about enculturating the children before the age of 7 into all the stories of the Bible. Not didactically, because you don't do didactic teaching to children until they're about 7, because until they ask how and why, there's no point. But they have a memory like they will never have again. So the medievals understood, okay, how did God make children? Amazing memories. Okay, the trivium, step 1 is memory, grammar. They can learn in 3 languages without knowing they're doing it in those first 7 years. And they'll switch from one to the other. And like all people who truly understand a language, you ask them afterwards, which language are you talking? They can't remember. Because what they remember is the content. And they remember that at a deeper level than we really understand. We have no real understanding of language at that level. Augustine struggled with it, and nobody's got any further than he did, I don't think. But I ended the afternoon by saying to them, look, I'm your older brother in the faith, and I know that you men never eat with your children, never with your daughters, and not usually with your sons until after puberty. That has got to change. This may be cultural imperialism for some of the most least educated people I have to deal with in the university. But if you want to change, that's what you have to do. And within a day, the guy who drives us every year said to Sally when she was being driven from A to B, I listened to what John said, and I went home, and for the first time, I didn't actually eat with the children, but I didn't eat first. I sat and watched. And I noticed that one of my children was a slow eater. He didn't get enough. So I gave him his own plate. They eat from a common pot. I got lots of pictures of the little runt on the outside of the massive people around the pot not getting his fair share. He's doomed. Given his own plate, he's not. One afternoon, the exposition of Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6 did more than 30 years of nutrition education. And we haven't been doing it. The biggest problem in North America today is the absence of fathers in any real sense in the lives of their children. I've only ever done an altar call in church once because I felt impelled to. I'd given this talk in a sermon, and at the end I said, because I was watching the audience, I knew they were more than with me. And I said, I can see that many of you want to make some sort of commitment. I think, I've never done an altar call, but I think it would be a good idea if you men who want to make a promise to have a role in your children's lives, especially in terms of teaching them the scriptures, stand up and come forward so that you can see who else in the church agrees with you. And those who love you can hold your nose to the grindstone over the next little while. 20 or 30 men came forward. We had the thing a few years ago when we had marches for fathers and kids to Washington in the state. I forgot what the movement was called, but they didn't tell them what to do. And, of course, the breakdown, when they see their father not around and having mistresses and the like, they're going to copy them. And that's what's happened.
We need to do our individual part. I am now asked from time to time to speak in various churches, and I'm speaking out of the context of having just spent the last 4 or 5 years researching why it is that so many young Christians are what's called deconverting, and I'm listening to their testimonials, reading their stories. And the number one thing that struck me, as I listened to all of the reasons they gave, there were about 6 major factors, but none of them were common to all. But there was something that seemed to be, was striking by its absence, and it has to do with that great and foremost command, is that when they talked about their previous experience of Christianity, it was what I might describe as expectation-driven. None of them, virtually none, talked about experiencing the presence of God in their lives on a daily basis. And how is that going to happen? And my number one recommendation to them is to go back to that great and foremost command and not make the assumption that I made for many years that I fully understand what that means, and therefore I'm carrying this out. It struck me one day, why would I ever think that I fully understand the full extent of what Jesus meant when he said that? Why would I think that? And at that point, I asked God, first of all, I said, God, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. All these years. Now I want by your Spirit to work within me, to take me on this road where I truly do love you, the way you fully meant when you said this. And I describe it as a road, because it's a direction, I think, for me, is that as the days and the months and years go by now, that's the heart and soul of authentic Christianity, is loving the Lord our God. There's a lot of other things that are important, but he says, if you love me, you will keep my commands. And it's the
love is obedience
is
for us.
That, yeah, it is. And also it seems that when you first love God, you start living in a way, there's an intrinsic change that happens. You start living in a way where you start to automatically begin to live the way God wants us to live without having necessarily to live according to rules. But the rules are important. The moral laws, they tell us when we're getting off track here, and we desperately need those too.
Well, that's why every epistle it's your mind that needs to be renewed. Your emotions will follow, but it's your mind. We worship with Anglicans. I didn't grow up there, but I love the opening prayer of the communion service. O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Spirit. There's not a wasted word there, is there? That's all we need. Once I began, the other most important point for me was coming across, I'm sure it's in Bonhoeffer, but I can't find it, but when Bonhoeffer was looking at what the church was going to have to go through in Germany, one of the things he said was, you're going to have hard times. And when your faith is in the doldrums, so to speak, you need to have some discipline in your life. And what you need is to ask God to give you can do it many times, but certainly at least once, a passage of Scripture to be your guiding light. And for me, of course, when I asked those students about the Sermon on the Mount, they couldn't say anything. I could say a bit, but then I realized as I walked away that I was in as much trouble as them, because it was I as a professor for undergraduates. I didn't need notes. They don't know anything. You've just got to get under their skin if you can. I would take a folder with me. It didn't matter what it was, because I wasn't going to use it anyway. Because the stuff that I knew. But I couldn't do that with the Sermon on the Mount. And I mean, to think that the number of people who are academics in the Christian world who could give lectures by the arm length without any notes, but couldn't give a decent account of any of our Lord's major statements. I mean, that's incoherent. It's not defensible. And Bonhoeffer says, add it to your prayers, and then you will have a passage brought to life. And it brought to your attention, first of all. Of course, it was the Sermon on the Mount with those students. So I did what he said. I learned it by heart. And then it has just been growing that was at 1987. And still bits of it come to greater light than they've been in before. And I can honestly say there's hardly a day that I go through without the Sermon on the Mount appearing at some time, usually in the middle of the night. And Bonhoeffer's absolutely right. It's transformative. So you must have read Toynbee as well. Not much loved person anymore. He has a few black marks, but at the end of his life, he wrote a book called A Historian Looks at Religion. And he was interested, he studied not the 80-odd societies that Unwin studied, but 20-odd. And he said, well, they have a common pattern. And the first one on his list was the loss of morality, the loss of objective moral truth. And that starts the rot. And of course, to have moral truth, you need a great book to learn it from. And currently, the reason why the young are so angry is that there's no depth to their lives. That's what they're reacting to, but they don't know that.
Yeah, they don't know it, but they are reacting to it.
They're deeply hungry, but they don't know they're hungry. And so they're eating junk food, like DEI, which I refuse to call DEI. DIE is much better. But I'm hopeful that the Claudine Gay affair will be the real start of the rot. You up to date on that?
Oh, well, I have been reading news excerpts maybe once every couple of days on this. I watched, before she resigned, I watched what she said. Then I read about the resignation.
It's hopeful.
Yeah.
The best accounts of it on YouTube, I think, are John McWhirter and Glenn Lowry, who have their own website, both black scholars. So they can say things that white scholars couldn't say.
Yeah.
And they do it very well.
They could.
But there's also a wonderful Australian woman who did a lovely piece on Unheard. And she writes with the panache and sometimes rudeness that an Australian can manage very well. But, and a woman, yeah, she can take them down. And Tom Sowell has been saying forever that affirmative action that takes a black kid from an uncultured background to the Ivy Leagues, he's just going to be left in the stream because they don't actually care about him. He'd be much better off going to his local state university where the better professors would be glad to have a bright student and he'd get mentored. This virtue signaling rubbish, instead of asking, okay, what does this kid need next? That's the difference. Well, the other thing that's happening at the moment, the last couple of days, Chris Rufo did an interview with a young doctor from Texas who had blown the whistle on transgender surgery and actually got it banned in the school in the Denver Children's Hospital, the Texas Children's Hospital, which is the biggest in the world. But of course, he's taken a lot of flack because he felt after a while it wasn't good enough to be an anonymous whistleblower. He had to be honest. And he's come out and he's taking a lot of flack. But Chris Rufo, who's been the main push against CRT, talked to him on Facebook a couple of days ago, and he's now in the 2nd million of clicks on it in 2 days. That tells you something about the hunger.
Well, I see moral laws. This is my perspective. I see moral laws as kind of like operating instructions that have been given to us by the Creator that actually are designed to maximize human flourishing and minimize human pain and suffering. And they're not invented by a bunch of nomadic sheep and goat herders thousands of years ago. I was meeting with the head of sociology department at Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. one afternoon, and he said something that I will always remember. And he says, the more data we get from the social sciences, the more we see that human flourishing is contingent on living a life that happens to correspond to the Judeo-Christian ethics, or more broadly, maybe traditional morality. That's what the data show.
Well, as long as we go after flourishing life on the things they do agree with, I often, if I'm in a liberal university doing a lecture with largely students, it doesn't matter what the title is, I can play the game of getting off track very briefly. And it's such fun to do. And it will go roughly like this. I've only been in your university a few hours, so I don't know any of you. But I do know something about you all. I know, for instance, that you all hate divorce. Coming out of the blue with a guest in the environment, you can see it. There's some people who nod. There are a lot of people who are horrified. And so timing is everything. You have to be quick. And I say, I can see that some of you are cross. But before you get angry with me, let me point out that I know I'm right and I can prove it to you. If divorce hasn't happened to you, it has happened to your friends. Statistically, all of you know kids who have gone through divorce. Has any child ever enjoyed it? Exactly. No one has. Many will come to understand that their parents should never have married in the first place because they were totally incompatible. And that's why if they'd been in a church community, people would say, no, you two give one another a break. You're not made for one another. You'll just drive one another mad. But so they're still their parents. They still want to love them in some sense, but they did not enjoy divorce. And I say, I have a professor who I met once and I appreciate a great deal, who has been saying to her class for 20 years, if you will keep my 4 rules and you divorce, I will pay you $1,000. And she's never paid out. But I'm sorry, that's not tonight's lecture. I must get on. And girls who have never spoken in public will say, what are the rules, please? And so I say, okay, I'll tell you the rules and you can go find it. It's a wonderful, if you've never heard Janet Smith talk about contraception, why not? It's absolutely brilliant. There's 250,000 copies circulating, so that tells you a lot. But the 4 rules are interesting. And for evangelicals, the first one, well, I think she's right now because it's very practical. She says, every year sit down with your spouse and give away 10% of what the Lord has given to you, to people or communities or organizations that serve other people. One of you will be more materialistic than the other, so you will help one another. Now, no sex before marriage. Now, I understand that's not going to happen in most cases, but if you are having sex before marriage, it would be a very good idea for you to withdraw from sex for at least 2 years before you marry. Because if you can't do that, you're not marrying for love, you're marrying for sex. And that will be a disaster. And then she has...
There's a lot.
The biblical one, don't marry somebody who doesn't share your faith. And the last one, which she does in a very funny way, is practice natural family planning, which is as effective as the pill nowadays.
Is it?
Yes.
Yep.
But it does require restraint, which is exactly your point.
Restraint is not an evil thing. Restraint is part of being human. It's what we ought to practice as human. The animals don't practice it.
Do you know about Augustine College?
I actually went on the website and I read a little bit about it. It looked like a very good program that you are involved with there.
It needs to be cloned into...
It's a 1-year program.
8 months, in fact. It needs to be cloned in every university town because it has about an 80% retention of faith in the kids who take the course. But I acknowledge immediately the selection bias there. To leave your peer group and go to do this strange course, you have to be courageous. But if you do, you've been identified as belonging to a particular group. But we're useless at advertising. So if you in your travels come across a bright kid who's being hammered by the university, that's probably, if they get to university, realize they're being hammered, every university will allow them to take a break nowadays. That's a good they'll do better. Better still in terms of not getting harmed is to come before you go to university. And I think we can make the case now in a way we haven't done to date, is that most of the damage is done in the first year where you get all the DEI stuff and the like. So if you come and do our course, if you're any good, we'll be able to get you into a university with first-year credits. And if we can't do that, you shouldn't go. But I don't say that. That would be demeaning or in somewhere or other, but that's the truth. I would like to see university education in the arts, anyway, down to a fraction of what it currently is.
I tend to agree.
So do keep us on your...
I will. I was impressed. Yeah, I was impressed with Augustine College.
One of these years we should persuade you to come, and we do a summer program for doctors, 1 week every year. We started it over 20 years ago because the only advertising we have is me. I do a lot of speaking for the Christian Medical Dental Association, more in the States than in Canada, because currently Canada is a bit wokish. The States is not, and I don't play that game. What it did have is the Americans have 20,000 physicians in the Christian Medical Dental Association. And the president used to talk to me once or twice a year. He was sending out a CD to the whole crowd. So any evangelical physician in the States who's in CMDA, which is most of them, will know who I am, simply because they're exposed to me so much. And then some of them sent their kids. And then within 3 or 4 years of starting, they started saying, when are you going to do something for us? And here's another area where I think we can do well. I said, well, I've actually written you off as irredeemable, but you do have one thing I need, your money. What would you pay? And then Americans, they don't mind being teased by Brit. It's amazing. And they said, well, could you do something that would get us CME credits? Now, everybody in the States has to get 1 credit a year in ethics. And I've been grandfathered in. I don't have a degree or anything like that, but I've been doing it forever, so they leave me alone. And so I said, yeah, I think we can handle that. What would you pay? And they said, well, I'd pay at least $100 a day for golf. Why wouldn't I pay the same sort of rate at least to you? And they've actually been the major funders of the college. We need to do it for lawyers. We need to do it for teachers. I mean, IV has lost its way, hasn't it, in many ways, over the years.
I'm out of the loop on IV.
Yeah, well, so am I. And I know when I understood what the problem was, that was around 2000, when I was bullied in going to an InterVarsity graduate program in Chicago conference. I didn't want to go, but the doctor running the medical stream, because they divide up into streams, said, we need you because we're being taken over by the feminists and they're pro-choice.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody will talk about abortion. And you will. I want you to. I went, and I was blessed because Dallas Willard and Tom Wright were the main speakers that year. Absolutely superb. And then it snowed, so we got an extra day. The airport was closed down, so the hotel stayed for an extra day. Nobody's going to be coming in today.
Yeah.
But when I mentioned the A word, there was an audible intake of breath.
It's a sacred cow.
And that simply will not do. I mean, the friendship evangelism, that's manipulative. You don't go out making friends to evangelize them. That's dishonest. Especially, I say to students, don't evangelize the people you're going to be with for the next 5 years, because you're going to do it whether you like it or not. They're watching you. And if you don't look different, keep your mouth shut. You're not going to be any use to us. And that applies across the ages. So I don't know a student organization at the moment that is, apart from the recognition that they know they need to do it in the American medical student programs. But finding the people to do it is hard because they haven't been brought up on hour-long expositional sermons every week. So they're biblically illiterate. And so they default to the woke ideas. And sexuality is going to be a good one to open up on. How do you get on with a liberal audience?
Well, most of my audiences in the years have been on campus, and most of them have been predominantly non-Christian audiences. That's where I've spent most of my time. So I have learned to, I've learned to say what I think needs to be said in a way. Number one is, I think it's important to be relaxed and friendly. Like the sun doesn't rise or set according to how well I do. And Christianity will not hinge on what I say in the next hour or so, but just to be relaxed and friendly. I find that being friendly and real and personable gets you 50% of the way right there. It's right there. So the other thing is, I always say...
How do you get the invitations?
Well, at first it was mostly from student clubs, Christian student clubs. I have been invited by, say, Muslim student clubs, even atheist student clubs to participate in their events. That was mostly how the invitations went. Occasionally I'd be invited to do a classroom seminar for some philosophy professor who wanted me to speak on a particular issue. But the other thing that I found was critical is to never be defensive. And I would always say, I'm going to have a Q&A at the end, and I'm counting on you to look to see what are the weak points in what I say, and I want you to bring that up in the Q&A because I can't cover everything here. And just knowing they're going to have an opportunity to engage me at the end, I don't think I've ever done, and I've spoken hundreds of times, universities across Canada, a little bit in the UK and the US. I don't think I've ever done an outreach where I have not had a Q&A at the end. I find it's critical to allow them to step up. And a lot of times I might necessarily respond, give them an answer to, let's say if it's an attack, I would rather ask them a question. I want to look what's underneath this and what question
what are they presupposing?
Yeah, there's a backstory here. I want to get into the backstory as best as I can when they pose let's say a question that's, I know they're not interested in my answer. They just want to kind of undermine me or something. I'm not sure, they usually attack. But my favorite thing, one of my favorite things to do is to go to the pub with a bunch of atheists, which is just me and a pile of atheists. And we just have a good time because they got me to themselves. And those are so rewarding, so rewarding.
One area that's really opened up in the last 20 years or so is the fact that, I don't know if you know this, but when I heard that you did physics first, I thought, well, that's a good start because the best places to go to university and have your faith stronger are physics, particularly quantum physics and cosmology, and now molecular biology. And that really comes as a shock to so many people. I remember the first time I did it, and it was, of all places, in Cuba. I've been to Cuba to teach half a dozen times or more. And mainly it was Christian doctors that we do a program on updating medicine, which they weren't getting from America, so they were glad that Canadians could come. But it was Christian doctors in Cuba who were running it. So when I looked at the program, I said, there's no Christian content here. Could you do that? I said, yes. So every year I did some aspect of Christian content and how that impacts the practice of medicine. But after one lecture, not the ethical bit, a guy came up to see me afterwards, and he turned out to be the head of the local department of Marxism and Leninism in the local university. I said, what are you doing here? And he said, I've come to see you. And I said, why? And he said, well, the students tell me that you say that Russia rotted from the inside. It was not brought down by American economic power. And he said, I agree with you. And when I saw that Russia was going to collapse, I knew that we were going to be troubled by it. So I stopped teaching Marxism-Leninism, and I tried to teach multicultural ethics. But the students go to sleep. But they tell me they don't go to sleep when you teach ethics. So I know that you maintain that it's not even possible to have an ethical system without transcendence. And I want to hear the argument. I don't mind losing. So I had one evening to prepare, and I did all the openings that I thought, and I had lots that would work, I thought. But when I got up from my seat to walk the 6 steps to the lectern, the good Lord wiped my mind clean and just put 3 words there. Or is it 3? No, it's 4. This message assembled itself. And I asked my translator, who was fortunately a Colombian-Canadian Christian, to write that on the board in Spanish. And then I asked the audience, what would you have made of this sentence if you had walked in and it was there? And they're smart people. They said, well, it's a grammatical sentence, but it's nonsense. And I said, quite right. And I turned around and crossed out, and I'd never had this thought before, crossed out the word message and put DNA in its place. I said, but you do believe this sentence. But DNA is not you and me. DNA is a blueprint for some major parts of us, not all of us. And suddenly you believe it. Because Darwin told you that. He's wrong. And the audience burst into applause. Because they'd been living under doctrinaire scientific socialism. And they knew it didn't work. and they knew that I had just put a bomb under it, and they were very willing to deal with the rest. Now, it's got much better since. I mean, now we know that the two major steps in biology are both impossible by chance. DNA is impossible by chance. It's just too complex, and it's getting more complex, not less. And any step from inorganic to organic is so incredibly difficult to do. It doesn't involve just getting reactions to work. You've got to get them to work and then stop them at the right mixture. You need about 20 enzymes to run a cell. I mean, the probability of this is, as John Lennox put it, 1 for all the molecules in the cosmos.
Well, I already had an engineering degree when I started biophysics, and I think, it is, because I remember one day in a genetics course, we were covering some of the molecular machines inside the cell, and there were animations of it, and it just made the hair go up in the back of my neck, and I said to the professor, "This is the closest thing I have ever seen to alien technology." And the professor says, "Yeah, it bothered me too, but you'll get used to it," she says. "But as an engineer, no, I don't get used to this. Engineers are worried about how we're going to build that." And it goes down to, information encoded in the genomes. That's why I did my biophysics, focusing on information.
That we all have a 3.5 billion ID number, which fortunately we don't have to write out. God works with only 4 letters in his alphabet and only needs 3-letter words. And he doesn't waste space, because he can take those triplets and start at number 1 and number 2 and read off 1,000 in a row from the same sequence, and both read sensed. I mean, how anybody can actually repeat that sentence and then say it happened by chance, I don't know.
That is true data compression there, when you can do stuff like that. And I'm not even sure how. I can't imagine the supercomputer would be required to...
They can't do that. They don't even know how to start writing the program. How would you do it?
No, the information and code, that was my specialty. How do we measure it, and what does it do in terms of protein structure was really what I focused on. But once one begins to understand the concept of functional information as defined in PNAS or in nature, it is an eye-opener. It is a serious eye-opener.
Well, it's not surprising that much of the push for allowing God back in is coming from people with computer background, information background. The laws of information science would be rather upsetting to the arts faculty if they understood them.
And unfortunately, that's a problem. There's a lack of technical background and expertise to even grasp the enormity of the problem of just simply believing this sentence assembled itself.
That's why people like you and me are needed. That DNA sequence, everybody can understand that. Everybody. After I'd been given that gift every year for my own course in biochemistry, if I could, and there wasn't a lecture in the room I was going to lecture in, I would go there early, put that on the board, and then disappear and come in a few minutes late and say, "What's that all about?" And go through this sequence. They never forgot that. It is, but finding the right illustration is important, isn't it? That's what our Lord did.
I think that's key. Yeah, it is key.
I often say to people who are in the literature area, look, deal with this problem, and in the education area. If I'm talking to a Christian audience, I say, if I asked you to sit down and write down the title of every parable and every miracle that Jesus did, you'd probably score at least in the high 90s if you've been a Christian for even a short period of time. But if I ask you to tell you what you learned in university 6 months ago, you couldn't pass the exam.
Sadly, there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah. I would not want to rewrite my...
It's absolutely true.
Yeah, I know. I cringe at the thought of writing my second-year exam, say, in electrical magnetic fields.
Yeah.
I just would not want to do that.
Did you see this year's Faraday lecture? I don't know if you know about Faraday lectures.
I've heard about the Faraday group in the UK. Are you talking about the Faraday group in UK?
No, this is the Royal Institute. Every Christmas they have a Faraday lecture for children.
Oh, okay.
Because of Michael Faraday. And this last one, I think it was this last one, it might have been the year before, an American took Faraday's own notes and rebuilt one day in his life, because he went to his laboratory one September, and at the end of the day he'd invented a functional electric motor. because he observed what other people didn't see, that the wire was moving. Yeah. They were all thinking in straight lines. He was mathematically incompetent because he had no formal education. He never even went to high school. But that Faraday lecture you would really love.
I'm sure I would. It makes one wonder how many...
You can find it on YouTube. The Faraday Christmas lecture on Faraday invented the electric motor. It's absolutely stunning.
It makes me wonder how many other discoveries are just waiting, are just almost right there in front of our faces, but we just don't see them.
Well, you must have had a few. I've had a few on my way. I mean, one paper that I wrote, I still don't understand, but it saved thousands of lives. And the only reason was a commitment to telling the truth. So I had a hypothesis which basically was clearly true, but there were some outliers. And they were more than 5 standard deviations from the mean. So if you're using a standard computer package, they won't even appear. The computer will wipe them out. But these were the days where you plotted your data by hand and you had time to think about it. Well, my mother had imprinted honesty in my on my backside fairly early on in my life. And so I thought I ought to go and look at those 4. And when I looked at them, I discovered they'd all died. And by this time, we were saving almost every child. And this was the last little group. They didn't die immediately when we got our hands on them. They died when we tried to refeed them. And when I looked at them, they had the different data gave a clue as to what might work, and it did. So that was the last piece in the puzzle before we reached 100% success with 10-pound 2-year-olds back to normal in about 4 months.
I had a gift in my PhD program. I was hearing about a program. I think insurance companies would use it, and they would run all sorts of data through this to look for patterns. And I thought to myself, what would happen if I put a multiple sequence array, a large two-dimensional array of protein sequences, all from the same family, but all different what would happen if I ran that through this insurance company's software? The very first run, wow. It was a wonderful, my supervisor was ecstatic, I was ecstatic, and it was basically a gift just dumped in my lap. Just by that one thought, what happens if I run a two...
And you took no credit for that?
No, I wasn't the inventor of that software. All I did is just wonder what happens if I run this biological multiple sequence alignment through that insurance company's software.
What did you learn from it? What result did it give you?
Well, immediately it started to show, like say in a simple protein sequence, let's think of it in terms, for the sake of our listeners, of just a linear sequence of symbols, amino acids. But in real life, about 70% of those fold in a complex 3-dimensional structure. And what this program showed is that it showed relationships between the different symbols in that sequence. And a lot of these times, the relationships were not close together in the initial sequence, but after folding, there was hydrogen bonds there, or covalent. There were van der Waals distance to each other. It also revealed binding sites. That when it folds, these 3 seemingly unrelated points in the sequence all come together, and those 3 points now are a binding site, and that's why they're so closely related.
But you're not supposed to ask the question why in science, but of course you did. You can see why. Yeah, I also think there's that the single nucleotide changes are not accidental. I think they build flexibility for change at the species level.
I've suspected that myself.
The folding that brings together all the key enzymes, so to speak, are in close proximity. So if something happens to damage one, it damages the whole thing, and you're gone. Because only 1 in 4 pregnancies makes it. God doesn't mind a high wastage rate at that stage. It's probably one of the seminars we'll meet at in heaven, You've probably got a list as I have. I want to hear why. The one I want to hear most is parasites. I don't understand why God allowed parasites to come into the world.
They're very interesting. They're fascinating.
We both have the same desire to see the next generation of Christians better educated than they've been. You should come and look at what we do in Ottawa and then think about doing it in Manitoba.
Well, I will actually consider that. Who knows what the next chapter is in my life?
Because you have the fundamental requirements that you have learned through your academic exercises, that being a Christian is a good idea. So you can teach with passion, which they long for, not pseudo virtue signaling rubbish, but just straight passion.
It's so important.
Yeah. And if you
so
keep your eyes open in your church and in other places for kids who don't like the memorize and dump system that we have developed. I mean, is this a disgrace, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's got to go.
Do you have any posters for Augustine College that I could put up on our church bulletin boards that I could start talking to youth about?
Yeah, we have some, and I don't have your address. Could you send it me at some point? I've been asked to give a close to this podcast, but it's beautiful. It has no closure. It's raised innumerable questions for both of us, and we've lots of shared answers. It means that, unlike so much liberal politics, we have an exciting ride ahead of us, and we have little doubt as to the outcome.